Hello and welcome to our webinar on the economic impact of COVID-19 on communities, a panel discussion. This is the second in a series of webinars aimed at cities and regions in the post-coronavirus era, initiating community conversations on what lessons we can learn from this crisis to make a more resilient and sustainable world. My name is Katie Phillips, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host, and I will be monitoring any questions our attendees have in the Q&A box. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to email me at phillips.1870@osu.edu. I'm going to kick it over to our moderator for this event, CURA's Director, Harvey Miller.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion today on the economic impacts of COVID-19 on communities. As Katie mentioned, this is part of our series on the impacts of coronavirus on cities and regions. We had a session, a webinar last month on the census and COVID. This month we're addressing economic impacts. Next month on Friday, July 31st at noon, we'll have a panel discussion on social equity, the impacts of social equity on COVID-19 in communities. Our guests will be Deanna West Torrance, who's founder and executive director of the North End Community Improvement Collaborative of Mansfield, Ohio. Michael Wilkos, who's the the senior vice president of community impact at the United Way of Central Ohio, and Jason Reese, who's a urban planning professor at Knowlton School at Ohio State University. So that will be next month, July 31st, and we're working on continuing this series beyond July through August and into the fall. So please keep up with us, cura.osu.edu. You can sign up for our newsletter. Also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. That way you'll never miss one of these events. Okay, today's panel on the economic impacts of COVID-19 on communities. We have three guests I'm going to introduce now in the order in which they'll give their opening remarks. Our first panelist is Bill Lafayette, and he's the founder and owner of Regionomics, which is a consulting business specializing in small area economics with a focus on strategic economic and workforce analysis and planning services. Bill helps clients in public, private, academic, and not-for-profit sectors understand regional and community economic, demographic, and workforce trends, and work with them to develop strategies to respond to those trends. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Harvey. Thanks for having me.
Our second panelist is Jennifer Clark. She's professor and head of the City and Regional Planning section of the Knowlton School of Architecture in the College of Engineering at The Ohio State University. She specializes in urban and regional economic development planning. Dr. Clark's most recent book is Uneven Innovation, the Work of Smart Cities from Columbia University Press, which I've been meaning to read. Is that available on Kindle, Jennifer?
Indeed it is.
Okay, good news for me.
You could have a copy if I could get in my office. I could have brought you one, but thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
And thank you for being here. Our third panelist is Eddie Pauline. Eddie Pauline is responsible for creating mutually beneficial relationships between the university, Ohio State, and corporate partners that lead to increased revenue and opportunities for both parties. Eddie works to generate, implement, and manage economic development and corporate partnership plans for the university to deliver planned outcomes and results with the goal of making positive impacts to the university and to the greater community. Eddie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Harvey. Pleasure to be here. My book is forthcoming, so we'll announce that in a couple months.
Waiting with bated breath.
Okay, we're going to have some opening remarks from the panelists. Bill, please.
Well, thank you. I guess my opening remarks are going to center on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, which has been absolutely stupendously awful. There is, however, an awful lot that we don't know yet, simply because economic statistics come out only with a lag, and especially when you get down to the state and local level, you gotta wait in some cases months and months before you can get a real good feel of what's going on. What we do know so far, though, is that Ohio is doing substantially worse than average. And that's been the case in every recession since at least the end of World War II. In this recession thus far, Ohio has lost 884,000 jobs, almost 16%. Ohio employment in April was at its lowest level since August of 1988. And most of that loss has been in leisure and hospitality, which has lost half its employment since February. On the other hand, the Columbus metro area fell only 14%, and that's a little bit better than the 14.5% national loss. We don't have May employment yet for the metro or the state, but as you all probably heard, US employment increased by 2.5 million in May. To put that in perspective, it's been 20 years since employment increased more than 2.5 million in an entire year. However, that huge gain made back only 11% of the 22 million jobs lost in March and April. The Ohio and Columbus employment estimates are coming out next week, and we can certainly expect something of an uptick in those stats as well.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Jennifer, please, your comments.
Well, I hate to follow bad news with more bad news, but I will try to do a little bit of some of the good news insofar as there is any, and there's not much. But I appreciate Harv's comments about my recent book, Uneven Innovation, which is really focused on technology in cities. The previous work that I did was on 2 books called Remaking Regional Economies and Working Regions. And both of those books really look at the question of how we design regional economies for sustainability and resilience. So moments like now, except I did not, in fact, envision a global pandemic when I was thinking about those designs, the sorts of exogenous shocks I was thinking about for those policy recommendations and economic development planning were on a much smaller scale of things like global trade, things like needing to upgrade industrial mixes in regional economies as we go through industrial transformation. So Ohio is very much within that space. And I quite agree that the industrial mix within Ohio is still sort of in progress of moving to the place to be more resilient and sustainable. But one of the things that I think we have to focus on is where those exposures really are, where we're seeing the exposures in the underlying structure of the economy and what we can do about it going forward. So we can't change that we're in the midst of a global pandemic. What we can do is move forward with the public health investments that need to be made and do everything we can to protect people. But in order to sustain institutions, we're going to have to think really smart about policy as well. And one of those things is this idea that maybe we've elongated our supply chains just too far, haven't been thinking about what our local food systems should look like, haven't thought about how much we should be investing in sort of smaller scale last mile mobility aspects. There's a lot of things that are being exposed right now about how we have sort of relied on I don't want to quite call it an economy that was a house of cards, but in some sense it kind of was, right? And so what we're seeing now is a need to think very clearly. The data is gonna help us. We need to see a lot more of the data, as was previously mentioned. But I do think that the hopeful thing about Ohio is that the institutional infrastructure in a place like Ohio looks so much more dense than it does in some places that were growing faster and actually looked more diverse in terms of their regional economies than many of the Ohio economies. did going into this. So I think that that institutional infrastructure, by which I'm talking about things like public health, I'm thinking things like the network of nonprofits, community-based organizations, is in a better condition in a place like Ohio than it is like in a place like Mississippi. So I think that's something to be hopeful about and to underscore how we're going to sort of activate that as part of this recovery.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that bit of good news. Appreciate it. Eddie.
Thanks, Harvey. So again, my role at the university is serving as its director of economic engagement. And what I spend my day thinking about is how to ensure that our university is in fact activating and sustaining the economic engine that it is. So how are we making it easy for people to engage with the university? How are we providing support for a variety of different economic activities around the region and beyond? I think our current situation is that COVID, unlike many other economic issues, has really impacted pretty much every revenue stream that the university has, which is unusual. So if you look at the way that we're funded, tuition, grants and contracts, services, donations, investments, every one of those big revenue streams has taken a hit. And as a $7 billion institution with an expectation to serve our community, that creates some concern. So we're trying to figure out what is the right way to balance the expectation that we'll continue to serve while also making sure we can keep the lights on. And I think part of the way to do that is to be working very closely with our economic development partners, Jobs Ohio, One Columbus, our regional partners, to ensure that as they're doing their work to drive more business and activity to Ohio and the region, we're seen as a resource for those efforts. And if we're all doing the right thing, that's going to create the economic activity that we need for recovery.
Okay, thanks, Eddie. So we'll get into some questions, and then we will open it up for audience questions via the Katie Phillips and via the question and answer feature on Zoom. So go ahead and submit questions, people in the audience, as we go on. But we've already addressed this a bit in the opening remarks, but I'd like to talk in more detail about the impact of COVID-19 on the Ohio's economy and what's the outlook moving forward. So Bill, can you elaborate, and then maybe Jennifer, if you can follow up. Bill, you're muted still.
Who's being a good participant. What we've seen so far is that every sector in the economy has taken a hit. And it's going to be a very long road back. One particular area of concern for me is the small business environment. Small businesses don't have the deep pockets that bigger businesses have, live much closer to the edge, paycheck to paycheck, as it were. And a substantial number of those businesses are going to not come back. And the problem of that with local economies is simply that locally owned, locally serving businesses trap income and trap wealth and spending, that if spending goes to chains, go to the remote headquarters cities of those chains. So those small businesses are kind of barrier reefs, as it were, and losing those is going to make our whole economy a whole lot less. It's going to diminish the impact of our spending. As far as the forecasts are concerned, you gotta understand that economic forecasts now are even less reliable than they typically are, and that obviously is saying something. Forecasts are based on precedent, and the environment that we're in now is unprecedented. This has never happened to us before. We have some indicators. There's a monthly survey that the Wall Street Journal conducts of economists, and most of the folks in that survey think that the economy now is very close to its bottom, but that it's going to be a long road back. The illustration that you hear over and over again is a Nike swoosh. From the consumer standpoint, rent payments and mortgage payments and student loan payments are being deferred. They're not being eliminated. And so those debts are going to have to be resolved before spending can resume. On the other hand, we have households that have been working during the lockdown, haven't had anywhere to spend their earnings. And so as a result, the savings rate surged to 33%. The question, though, is that whether those households are going to have the confidence to spend. Consumer sentiment has crashed. It's recovered some in the results that the University of Michigan released this morning. And there is always the threat of a second wave. And if we get a second wave, we're going to be in big trouble. We're seeing threats of that already. So I continue to be Bummer Bill.
Jennifer, what's your perspective, especially as a relative newcomer to Central Ohio? What do you say?
Yes, as a relative newcomer to Central Ohio, most of my sense of this is more in a comparative context. And I do think that it's comparative both across time and across space. So I'm very much thinking about this as compared to the last recession, which was, shocker, less intense than this is going to be, and looking at this the way comparing what the assets are, sort of the underlying capacities of Ohio versus other places, and certainly Columbus in particular, and Ohio State in particular. And I do have to say that I think that one of the things that's really interesting, and when I say interesting, I want to put the caveat, this is a horrible pandemic. And when economists and people who do economic development start to talk about the interesting part about it, that's stipulating that this is understanding that we understand that it's a public health crisis, but we also need to analyze this in order to create the policies that will indeed mitigate the impacts, right? So one of the things that's so interesting about this is how differently it's affecting both the labor supply side and the demand and consumption side of it, right? So we already knew that we had very much a consumption-based economy, that the demand was coming from a lot of the services side. What this stopped very quickly on a dime was a different sector than what we usually see in a recession. We don't usually see it immediately be retail. We don't immediately see it be services. Those things come second to something else, whether it's one of the more basic parts of the economy. This went the other way around because spending just stopped. Consumer spending really was arrested very, very quickly. And if you look at those UI claims, you can see that just, within a week, right, that this happened. So the timing of that is pretty dramatic. And this also has to do with the fact that there isn't anything fundamentally wrong with our labor supply right now, except that they can get sick, right? This is what's wrong with the labor supply. It's not a skills mismatch. It's not a spatial mismatch. It's not a major retraining issue. It's not that different kinds of firms came into the area. It is literally that people are scared to do the work because of the illnesses they expose themselves to. That's a very different policy question than most of the labor supply policy questions that we have. And on the demand side, part of this goes to what Bill was saying, is that we do not have a precedent to tell us where we are going to level out in terms of what consumption is going to look like on the recovery side of this, right? So we know people are going to be spending less money, but we don't know exactly what choices they're going to make. Right? We don't know. We know they're going to have to buy food, but we don't know how much of their rent. We don't know where the substitutability is going to show up in terms of on the spending side. Right now, the policy interventions are trying to essentially put things on pause. As many things on the cost side for individuals that can be put on pause, whether it's mortgages, whether it's student loan payments, whether it's rent payments, to put those on pause so that the decline in income can be not completely devastating to people. But there's a trust there, right? You actually have to have trust of all of the major actors in the economy, whether both the government, but also the people to whom the money is owed, right? They have to trust that the pause is actually part of the solution. And I think part of the question is how long that trust lasts and what it is that the public sector has to do to maintain that trust for individuals to stay calm, but also for firms and for for the people who own the money to actually stay calm long enough for this to resolve.
People staying calm has been working really well so far as I can see. But so clearly, this is different than the Great Recession in the early 2000s. So, and it's unprecedented, as both of you said. How do you move forward from this? We know it kind of worked in the Great Recession. That's debatable whether it worked, and what's happened to things like social inequality over the last decade or so. What do we do now?
So we've had a couple questions roll in, and I just want to say I'm not ignoring you, but some of these questions will fit in better later. But one of them that would fit in well now is, without a vaccine, can we expect a more robust economy going forward?
I don't think so. I think that vaccine is a requirement, or at least an effective treatment, short of the double lung transplant that we saw the other day. People are shaken. There are substantial numbers of households, such as mine, who are staying put, who are not leaving the house except when we absolutely have to. We're certainly not going out and spending our money at restaurants except on carryout. And so that lack of confidence, the fear of getting very, very sick and possibly dying is really substantial. But to the original question, one positive thing that we have going for us now that we haven't had going for us in any previous recession is that the underlying economic fundamentals are better than they typically are. Every recession has come about because something went wrong. In the 2008-2009 recession, it was the real estate market translating to the banking system. In the 2001 recession, it was the dot-com bust. Before that, the 1991 recession was an effort to control inflation. And so before COVID hit, economists were generally expecting a reasonably good year in 2020. So the underpinnings are stronger than they typically are. That's one saving grace, I think.
Bill, I think that's a good point. I just wanted to add how that kind of plays out at the university too, because we also went in to this with a pretty solid financial base. We did a lot of creative things to shore up many financial operations at the university. And then we proactively cut back when this started. So for example, in order to save money, we and still do have a travel restriction. There were other types of purchasing limitations that were implemented as well. But again, the university, I think, spent about $1 billion last year on sales and services. And you start to wonder, even though that lack of spending helped the university, what impact did the travel restriction, for example, cause across the country with our 60,000 employees or so not doing those trips, not being on campus, buying things for lunch and things like that. So it's an interesting situation when you think about efforts to shore up institutions and their standing before this started versus the impact that proactive stance took on the economy.
So Eddie, oh, sorry, Jennifer, you wanted to jump in? Sure.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point, which is that in economic development, we call it the meds and eds sort of strategy. Think about it as the anchor tenant strategy, right? In the mall, we're the Macy's, or malls are a bad example at this point. But the idea that it really is something like a university the size of Ohio State that generates a huge amount of the spending and the multiplier effects in a regional economy like this, right? Certainly that's true of other cities in Ohio as well. So when they pull back, it's not, it's great to be able to pull back when you need to for the purposes of managing your institution, but the effect it has on the regional economy is non-trivial. And that is one of the things that when we think about what policies we want to advocate for, when we think about how we want to talk about this, again, asking universities to go through that level of austerity is not just going to affect the university. It affects all of the downstream purchasing and all of those firms that are connected to it. So the impacts are, a real problem. And if you talk about, most research will demonstrate that if there's any way that you can continue to operate those organizations and keep those consumer, customer and supplier relationships going, do it, because rebuilding them after you've broken them takes a long time.
Right. I'm pretty sure we were able to do the things we needed to do to protect salaries and paying people. In fact, I'm not sure we have laid off or furloughed anyone, even those that have not been able to execute their job from home. So again, we're not spending as much, but at least we're still paying people so they can pay their utility bills and things like that.
So let's talk a little bit about Central Ohio, because it's been the growth engine of Ohio for the past decade or so. Will that continue? And do we expect the levels of construction and development to continue? Why don't you start, Eddie, and then we could move on to the other panelists.
Yeah, as some people may have seen, there was news about us stopping, I think 11 projects, construction projects, which again, in order to be fiscally responsible, it was the right thing to do. So it got a lot of press, people were concerned, but what didn't get as much press is that we, as an institution, have a $2.4 billion spend over the next 5 years in construction projects. So the 11 projects that we stopped short term are a very small piece of our larger construction and development plan. So in terms of a little bit of optimism, I think you can count on the university to continue to move forward with our development plan. In particular, our West Campus Innovation District is seen by a lot of economic development partners as maybe the way that this state can recover. That, and again, that's that's a decade-long project. But when you think about the 300 acres west of campus, and at some point having 22,000 people working over there, that could be a driver to get through all of this.
Bill, what do you think?
I think our population growth and our economic growth will continue. I say that mostly because the reasons for the growth that's happened thus far are still very much in place. Our better than average population growth actually goes back to the 1980s. The 1980s and 90s were really good decades for us in terms of job growth. Better growth in the expansions and less decline in the recessions. And the only weak period we had in that whole time was the 2002 to 2007 expansion. And I strongly suspect that the reason why our growth was 40% slower during that period than the national average was because we didn't buy into the real estate boom that was powering growth in other places. That, though, meant that we got hit less hard during the recession. We certainly can't be certain of this, but I think we're going to continue to have better job and population growth, in part because of our economic structure. Our economy in Central Ohio is primarily a knowledge economy. Economies around us are predominantly industrial economies. I have a recent book. My co-authors and I argue in this book, which is called Knowledge Economies and Knowledge Work, that this is a shift from the industrial economy to the knowledge economy that's going on across the globe. Manufacturing employment's been slower than the overall employment growth since the mid-1950s because through the impact of knowledge work, manufacturing worker productivity has increased faster than output. And as long as our job growth's greater than other places, especially those around us, it seems to me that we're going to continue to attract jobs, and that's positive for population growth. Of course, population growth depends on a bunch of other things too, like preferences and demographic shifts, available housing, housing affordability relative to other places, and all sorts of other stuff. Those are harder to predict, but overall, I would think that we're probably going to continue to do pretty well.
Okay, so Jennifer, Ohio cities have been doing pretty well in terms of development and population growth in their central cities. I mean, Columbus has done well, but so has Cleveland and Cincinnati to a large extent. Do you think this will continue, or will the suburbs become the new downtowns after this pandemic? And what about small towns as well?
So real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, before we get to that question, we had one related to the previous question, which was what policies can be implemented to help people of color, especially Black business owners during this pandemic? So that's going along with the small business owners.
Yeah, well, coincidentally, CBS News has in the last half hour posted a story that 40-some% of African-American owned businesses are likely not to survive the pandemic. That's a serious problem. And the reason for that is simply a lack of income and a lack of capital. And so to the extent that government is able to direct funding towards small businesses, particularly minority-owned, women-owned businesses, that could help them survive. I saw the other day that the state is planning not to draw on its rainy day fund in the coming fiscal year, I would argue that it's raining pretty hard right now, and we probably ought to think about that, especially in supporting minority businesses, small businesses in general.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And I'll add that I think the organizations that have the means to and the infrastructure to have diverse supplier policies need to probably take a hard look at those and ensure that the percentage of goods that they're buying from diverse suppliers is what it needs to be, and potentially increase that percentage as well. I think most large organizations, I know Ohio State has one, most large organizations have these policies. Some cities have these policies. You know, can there be some leadership in purchasing to ensure that those dollars are being spent with businesses that are at risk?
Yeah, I would suggest that there's sort of two sides of that one. One is the one that Eddie just outlined, which is really the having large employers and large suppliers make sure that they are thinking about who they are doing business with. The other thing is that it would have been possible, and it is still possible, for the federal government, when they construct these policies coming at the lending policies, the loan policies, they could construct them with specific targets or specific preferences for minority-owned businesses, for women-owned businesses, for small businesses. They aren't doing that with any real precision. So far, the policies they have put in place have lacked precision, I would say. And as a consequence, you're going to see, present trends continue, which is if for firms that already had differential access to capital, they will continue to have differential access to capital in this new amplified environment of past trends continuing. So that's unfortunate, and it can be remedied. There is a clear path to remedying it. I'll stop there with that one. On the one thing I just wanted to go back to on the issue of what's the condition of the labor supply in this environment. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there is a real difference in this contraction because of the women are in these occupations. Women are overrepresented in many of this first round of highly affected occupations, and that the knowledge work piece, we see a lot of women in the knowledge work and knowledge service work, and when you have things like the schools shut down, no childcare, this creates a real crunch in terms of women's participation in the labor market because of the uneven level of women's work and caretaking, right? And this, of course, because it's also a public health crisis, whether it's a question of taking care of children in the household or parents or other people who have special needs or medical needs in the household, it's making it very difficult for women to be able to continue with full-time jobs. So that, again, 2 months is one thing, 6 months, a year is another thing, and how this plays out in terms of occupational and gender segregation is going to be, something we just don't know yet. Now, to cities.
Yeah, back to that.
I actually think that that people people were already coming back to cities in over the last about 15, 20 years in a way that they hadn't done in the previous period. And part of that had to do with this live, work, play. Real estate investors have been really good at making this argument, but also I think that we are looking at a generation that is interested in living in cities. They understand the advantages of cities. They understand the advantages of density. In the advantages of community. And this particular crisis, I think, has just underscored that, the value of public spaces, whether the public spaces are for leisure, whether they're heavily programmed public spaces, or whether they're sort of loosely programmed public spaces. You think about the metro parks and how much use that they have been getting. And it's not just our metro parks, it's all over the country. People are going back to their public parks and spending all weekend in doing things in their public parks, because these are spaces that they're now starting to understand are part of their everyday, they want as part of their everyday life. bike trails. Actually, streets in the cities that connect to bike trails. People all over the world right now are demanding that they have more bike lanes so that they can just visit their neighbors and visit around in their neighborhoods. And then finally, the issue that, you know, while density does freak some people out in this sense of proximity and spread of disease, there's that discourse that's going on. At the same time, it is in cities where we have the robust top drawer public health and medical resources. We don't have that in smaller communities because that has not been the way the US has invested in its public health system. It has not decided to do an evenly distributed access to high quality medical care. It is centralized in cities and in particular kinds of cities. So if you want access to high quality medical care, you got to be pretty close to a city in this country, and with very few exceptions. So I think that you know, the same thing with food delivery, same thing, you have to be within the delivery shed of these resources and these services. So I don't think that actually the suburbs are going to get much of a boost out of this particular crisis. I think that we are going to have to think about a lot of things, but isolation, further isolation, I think will not be attractive.
Okay. One last question, then we can turn it over, I think, to some audience questions. And this has to do with the role of Ohio State in helping with the recovery and moving forward past this crisis. So we've already talked about Ohio State can do that by continuing to spend money and building things. But how about beyond that? What can we do as faculty, as students, as staff members of Ohio State, and members of the Ohio State community to try to help resolve some of these issues surrounding economic development, some of the social issues that were raised, and so forth? Let's start with, let's see. Let's go first. I'll let you guys select.
Well, I think one thing that Ohio State can certainly do is continue to focus on buying within Ohio, buying locally, and supporting smaller businesses, locally owned businesses to the extent possible. That's one definite thing that all can do.
Eddie.
I think our you know, we have a responsibility. It's in our mission as a land grant to be urban serving, and the idea that Ohio State is seen as a resource for the community is really important to convey. Many people are intimidated by the sheer size of the institution, but there are a growing number of efforts and offices on campus that have made that process easier to engage. So for example, 3 years ago, we set up our corporate engagement office that houses our tech transfer and commercialization efforts. It houses economic development. It houses corporate business development. So it can be seen as sort of a one-stop shop for people that want to pursue some activity at the university, both internally and externally. It's a group of people that are focused on making these connections to ensure that, again, the economic engine that we are can be activated. And I think just an overall sort of culture shift of being attuned to external relations, recognizing that we have to be more agile, we have to be responsive, we have to be reliable. Partnerships and collaborations are what will get us through this pandemic and let us recover quickly. So Ohio State needs to model that behavior.
Jennifer, from the academic side, we do have resources such as Cura and the Knowlton School. What should we be doing?
I think that, and you know, we're not the only ones going through this sort of experience of trying to figure out what it is that how the university should engage in its regional economy and its state economy in a more robust way. So if we think about, back to your land grant mission point, the ag extension, then the evolution to to the manufacturing extension partnership. And then the question becomes, okay, is there a 21st century version of what should really be happening here? And what does that model look like? And how big does it need to be, right? And when we look at some of our peers in North America, if we look at something like Industry Canada, they make sure that they have got people who are working with firms in a way that's far more hands-on and real time and than what we do in MEP or what Ag Extension does, because it's not just one industry, right? It's actually across the board. So meeting people where they are and then helping them find a way to connect with the resources of the state, including universities. So that it's almost mentoring, right? It's almost mentoring. And it's that the idea of maybe it's not just technical assistance, it's also mentoring around finance and development. I mean, if you think about if we had some sort of system like that today, those folks could actually be talking to individual firms about all of these programs that just came down the pike, and the best way to engage them, and the best way to find technical assistance, and the best way to innovate into this next environment, whether it's a remote or teleworking environment for both their employees, but also for their customers, right? Teaching e-retailing to traditional firms so that they can keep their production going, but they don't have to have the same connection to retailers. All of those models could be things that we have part of essentially a 21st century MEP, right? But the question is really, do we see that as a serious need for investment? And it would sit someplace, as one of these intermediaries. We're essentially talking about the development of a new intermediary. And there was questions about this coming out of 2009. Whether it was time to develop more robust intermediaries. And, my hope is that we start to think about that again, because I think this exposes again that there are some real gaps, and resilience comes from having bridges across those gaps, having intermediaries that help intervene in those spaces.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Katie, do we have some questions from the audience?
We have a lot of really good questions, and I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But one of the first ones that came in today was regarding Wall Street. Does anyone have any idea as to why it is swinging so far up and down lately?
Why,
I'd like
yes.
to know too.
Back in my finance classes, they taught us that stock markets fully and fairly reflect all publicly held information. And as new information comes in, the market absorbs it. And what we're seeing is a very almost schizophrenic flow of news. Really, really good one day, really, really bad the next day. And so the volatility is simply a result of reactions to the bit of news that's just come in. And we're certainly going to continue to see that, I think.
I don't think that's wrong at all. I think that's a good explanation of it. I also think that there's another piece of this, which is that nobody knows where to put their money. I mean, there's no place to put money. And so, one day everybody just is, and there's a lot of money. Like, the other thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of money in the economy right now. It is just really poorly. It is not distributed well, but there is a lot of money flowing around. So one day it sloshes into the stock market, and then, something else comes up on CNN and it sloshes back out. But there is, when you've got nothing in terms of interest rates, basically zero interest rates, right? Nobody knows where to put money right now. So we're going to see this sloshing around for a while, and until people figure out how to make investments, like building, for example.
Okay. Another question, perhaps, Katie.
Let's see. We had a good one earlier asking about childcare. It says, it is estimated that we could lose 45% of childcare centers, most of which are small businesses in Central Ohio. How do you see this impacting the economy, and how might institutional infrastructure be activated to support this essential service?
I think this is really difficult. It depends if they go out of business, which many of them have very, very small profit margins to begin with. And generally, and very often they're not large, right? And so the idea of how much bookkeeping and banking capacity that they have is, financial management essentially capacity that they have tends to sometimes not be very robust either. So, if you see these go away and then come back, you're going to see a lot more in the informal daycare, right? So it's going to take a while. I think this is a real serious problem. And I don't have an answer to this other than to say that it may not be a private market solution to this the way that it looked before.
Yeah. And on top of that, there are new restrictions, new requirements for what you have to do in order to be a child care center. And those were imposed a few years back, and they've been phasing in.
So do you think that we're working at home for the most part, like forever now? And what do you think the effects will be if that continues? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Are we now on Zoom forever?
Well, I think that there's going to be a whole lot more working at home than there was before. Employers have been kind of kicking this idea around for years and just haven't really had the guts to implement it. And now all of a sudden they are being forced to implement it, and they're finding out in many cases it's working pretty well. So I can see a CFO walking into an office space and asking him or herself, why are we paying for all this real estate? So I'm expecting a whole lot more working at home permanently. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, what will be the effects of this? And maybe the other panelists can jump in now, Jennifer or Eddie. I mean, what's going to happen now? Jennifer, you mentioned about cities still being attractive places, but people are working at home.
Yeah, I mean, I did a fair amount of work on this this issue before it actually happened. So testing some hypotheses here. Yeah, the city. So the question in my mind is there's some really big questions here, which is who bears the responsibility for the infrastructure for working at home, right? So who bears the cost of that? So if firms are going to shift, and they shift a lot to workers and a lot to cities anyway, but if firms are going to shift the responsibility for provisioning the workplace to individual workers, and then all of the infrastructure to make that work at the same level, so electricity and internet and all of that, that's supposed to get shifted to whom? The city to provision the infrastructure and the individual to pay the fee to have it. This is completely, this throws the current the current employment contract, such as it is, into the air. We're renegotiating the costs and the risks here substantially, and both the city and the individual employer, the city by which I mean whatever the jurisdiction is, right, and the employee are about to be asked to take on significant costs because the firms are going to shed those costs. If that's where we end up, we're going to have to renegotiate the contract.
Part of that renegotiation involves tax impacts, because in Ohio, you are taxed where you work. And if we all start working at home, they're going to have to think that through, particularly if there is no central location. There was this stopgap bill that the state passed to say that you work, if you live in Columbus and your office was in Dublin, you will continue to pay taxes to Dublin. But how does that work if there's no central office anymore?
And I'll just add, let's not forget about the people that cannot work from home. They have jobs that you cannot sit in front of Zoom and accomplish. And there's a lot of those people. And then there's I don't think we have any psychologists on the panel or former psychologists on the panel, but I for one need to interact with people. face to face, or I'm going to lose my mind. So, how long is that that lack of human action, lack of human interaction, sustainable for a lot of people is a real question. But if we have to do it, we'll get through it, I suppose. But I think it's going to be pretty painful for a variety of different people.
Somebody asked, what is the process by which the length of supply chains will be reduced? And that came up early in the panel. So let's touch upon that for a few minutes. Jennifer?
So say it again.
You talked about the fact that our supply chains have been really spread out globally, and we have, or maybe it was Bill, but or I think it did come up about. So what is the process by which the length of these supply chains will be reduced? We're thinking more locally and making our economy more resilient, because long supply chains are fragile.
Well, I mean, for one thing, the way that over the last, I don't know, 30 years, you could ballpark it in a couple of different ways. But the idea of many of these supply chains got elongated because you're basically doing bids, competitive bidding, and whoever has the best bid, that's who you're dealing. It had nothing to do with location, right? Mm-hmm. And the issue here now is, does it have something to do with location? Are we actually going to internalize the cost of the risk of the distance, is the way to think about it. And I mean, there are other considerations too, but it's the risk of the distance. So we were already having this conversation about onshoring. Sometimes we call it onshoring. Sometimes, if you think about something like Fukushima, where all of a sudden everybody in the car industry was like, oh, that was made there. We can't get that for 6 months now. So we've had a couple rounds of this now in the last, I would say, 10 years, where people have started to figure out, like, wait a second, maybe it's not just about it being a cheaper per unit price. Maybe I need to factor in the risk of that distance. And I think this is another one of those things where, when there are moments where we look and we say, oh, wow, the fact of that distance really does expose a risk that I'm not willing to, I have a price I could put to it. And two, I don't want that risk. So who else can do that? So how do I sort of hedge my bets about having only one supplier for that, or having a distant supplier? The rethinking of that is strategic, though. And again, I think that if we had sort of a 21st century MEP, one of the things that would be happening with firms right now would be having a conversation with technical experts about, hey, do you want to reduce that? Do you want to reduce that risk? Let's think about how to do that. If you think about places like Makers Row, there are a number of firms and intermediaries that have developed, but particularly on the East Coast, that have been doing this for small manufacturers for the last 5-8 years as part of that sort of back to America, but high-tech back to America production stuff. So niche and small scale production. Whether that happens for large scale production, I think would be a really interesting question, because the model is there, but the sort of mentoring isn't.
Okay. Now we're just about out of time. I want to make a comment that we've gotten a lot of questions about transportation, mass transit, climate-friendly transportation. We're working on a panel in August on the effects of COVID-19 on transportation, so stay tuned for that, those of you who are asking those questions. Just a couple minutes left, maybe a closing comment from each of the panelists. Let's start with Eddie. Sorry, I caught you off guard.
No problem. Enjoy the conversation. I think that I'd like to believe that Ohio State is an economic anchor. We'll be fine, and we will get through this. There's no institution in Ohio that has the ability to make the impact that I think we can. Again, $15.2 billion in impact. I think our direct job impact is 123,000 jobs across the state. We're the 4th largest employer in the state. We have a huge academic medical center. the collection of assets we have and the brain power of our employees is going to be a huge asset for the state of Ohio, and I believe that we will remain an economic engine for the state.
Good. Thank you for being here today. Bill, just real quick, because we're just about out of time. We are out of time.
There is a natural impulse to project your current state of affairs forever into the future. I would caution us all against that. We are going to come out of this. There will be some things that will change fundamentally. However, for the most part, we're going to be back to normal before we know it.
Thank you. And Jennifer.
Yeah, I just stay safe, stay healthy, and don't lose your noodle if you can do that at all. Don't do that. And, anything we can, if you can do those two things, if you can support your community economically, socially, culturally, social justice, do it. We'll get through it together.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
No, just amen.
Oh, amen. Good way to end. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks panel. Terrific discussion today. And we'll see everyone on July 31st, Friday at 12 p.m. for our panel on the social equity impacts of COVID-19. Bye everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you all.